Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Caseware webinar. Today we are looking at risks and controls in the Cloud Audit apps. Actually, more specifically, we're looking at risks and controls in the UK company audit Mercia Cloud Audit app. I say we're joined today by James Clarkson, Professional Services Consultant at Caseware UK. James is going to take you through the content today. And also be on hand to answer any of your questions related to risks and controls in Cloud Audit. My name's Tom Jeffrey. I'm one of the I'm the Senior Education and Media Technician at Caseware UK. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the session today, making sure it all runs smoothly, also monitoring your questions and that sort of thing. And in terms of questions, we've got a bit of housekeeping here. Many of you will already be familiar with how to do this, but you can use the Q&A option on your toolbar to submit your questions during the session. There is a lot of content that James is going to be covering today, but I'll try and interrupt him if I can with any questions that are relevant to what you're seeing. And also, we should have some time at the end for Q&A. Any questions that you ask us, as I say, we'll get through as many of them as we can, but any we don't answer will go into a Q&A document that will be uploaded to our knowledge base to accompany the recording of this session. And we'll also get back to you afterwards with any questions that we don't answer live. So we've got the agenda here. I might have skipped to that slightly prematurely, but I'm going to hand over to James and we'll get started.
Yes, thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. It's just afternoon, so welcome to the session. As Tom said, do ask questions as we go. We should have time for a few questions at the end, and any others will be included in the Q&A document. Okay, so overview of the agenda, we see it on the screen there, but it's important for any audit engagement that we're identifying risks and assessing them in the appropriate way, so that we can consider their impact on the audit and to make sure our audit work is going to address all the right assertions that we need to for each area within the audit. So we're going to be going through recording and assessing risks in quite some detail. And included in that, we're going to have a look at how we can use some relatively new functionality to add risks into our audit engagement. So that is the risk library. It was added several months ago now, but we can use it to bring risks into our engagements quite quickly. We're then going to move away from risks a little bit and look at how we record and assess controls. A lot of the controls we'll be recording will be those that address the risks. But we'll all be placing different levels of emphasis on controls within our engagements. So for those who aren't placing so much emphasis, we want to make sure we're completing at least the fields that we need to complete the Mercia documentation. So we'll be going through the control side of things, and we're then going to finish off with looking at how that all impacts on our audit approach and our design of our work programs, making sure we've got the relevant procedures included. So I'm just going to find my screen sharing, and let me bring that up. It should be that screen, and hopefully everyone will be able to see that now. So as Tom said, we're focusing on the company audit Mercia template. It's the UK company audit template. And on this screen here, I've made no customizations to the template, so it should be the Caseware standard. So everything you see should be standard Caseware, standard sort of Mercia documentation in there. Now, when we're considering risks within our audit, we can document risks at any point, but of course, we're going to be looking at that at the planning stage. When we're working through planning, we'll be following our B01 planning checklist, and you'll see that I've been completing some of the planning so far, working through it in the logical order. And then I come to the first sort of question in the checklist related to what we're looking at today. So completing the internal control design implementation of controls form. Now, this is actually listed before we come to the risk assessment, but this is one area where there is a bit of an overlap in the documentation in terms of the order we're going to be completing it, because some of the risks or some of the controls you'd record on the B24 are controls that are addressing significant risks. And if we haven't yet considered risks or documented and assessed risks, we can't fully complete the B24. So this is one area within the documentation where you are going to be moving backwards and forwards between the different documents. So for ease today, really, I'm going to skip the control section. We'll come back to that later. And we're going to come down to our risk assessment and audit approach section. Now, the first question here asks us to evaluate key risks at the financial statement and assertion level and record the effect on the planned audit approach. And we'll be doing that on a few different documents. We're actually going to be using the annotations on the right here. So we're going to start with the B30. We're going to see that will feed through to the B31. And again, there'll be certain things we need to do on the B32 so that we can fully complete the B30 and consider the impact of the risks on the audit approach. Now, when you do go to the B30, I'll just click through to it now. You're going to be asked, firstly, about risks of material misstatement at the financial statement level, and you need to identify risks. Now, we have a drop-down menu here. We can't actually add our own risks into this form directly. So to get risks to appear in here, we have to add them into our audit engagement, either from the risk and controls risk screen, which I can come to now. We've got a new risk button up at the top there, or from within any document in the engagement, we can use the plus button at the top right and select to add a risk there. Now, I would really recommend trying to use the plus button to add a risk and actually adding risks as you come across them when you're in the early stages of planning, perhaps even when you're out doing interim audit work, completing your permanent file documentation. Because you'll find that whatever document you're in, if I'm in my PF1-1 entity and environment document, and I'm doing my work on this document, completing my notes, and perhaps in this industry section here, found out there's increased competition, new product releases from competitors, reducing demand for our clients' products. So they're carrying out some quite aggressive discounting to try and maintain sales. Now, immediately, that flags up a potential risk to me, probably about valuation of stock and possibly even going concern. So while I'm documenting this within the permanent file document, I can come up to the plus button at the top right, and I can select to add a risk. And it opens this panel. So you'll see our position in the document we're working on is maintained in the background. So we don't have to leave the document to come back to it later. We can just add a risk as we go. And it does make it nice and easy, actually, further down this panel when we're referencing the source of the risk, because it's something we're working on right now. So while the risk's fresh in our head, we can start to populate this risk card. So what is the title of the risk? I'm going to try and type in overvalue. Or let's change that. Stock may be overvalued. Don't want to assume. And we can then add a description of the risk. Now, I'm just going to populate the word description because you don't need to sit and watch me type, but just so we can see where that feeds through to the documentation later. We then need to state whether this risk is at a financial statement level or an assertion level. You can only select one. I know we have revenue recognition added in every engagement file as financial statement level and assertion level. But for this risk, it's going to be an assertion level, so I'll select that there. We're then asked, what is the status of the risk, normal, significant, or fraud? Now, if it's a fraud risk, just so you know, we can only select one here, but if you select as a fraud risk within the documentation itself, it will be treated as being significant as well, as you may expect. But in this case, I'm going to say it's a significant risk. I'm going to apply a bit of judgment because actually at this stage, I may not know because I haven't assessed the likelihood of misstatement or the magnitude of misstatement to see what the inherent risk is. And wherever that comes out at on the scale we use to assess the risk, that could impact my assessment of the significance of the risk as well. So I'll set it as significant, but this may be one thing that you might want to come back and update later once you have performed the full assessment. Because we've selected that this is an assertion level risk, we need to link it through to the audit areas. So what area of the audits does this risk impact? Now, when you click into it and you can select an area, you can use this, well, dot button icon to the left-hand side of each area to expand the area if you want to be a bit more specific in terms of the groupings you're allocating the risk to. I'm just going to allocate it to stocks as a whole for today. Once you've added the audit areas that are applicable, you're then asked what are the relevant assertions. You see reference to the assertions here. Now, it's important we only select the relevant assertions because for every assertion you do select here, you do have to perform a risk assessment for the likelihood, magnitude, and misstatement. So I'll select valuation. We then come to the source reference of risk. Now, this is why it's really nice to add the risk as you go, because I know I'm working in my PF1-1, I'm on the industry section, so it's really easy for me to say where I've identified the risk in my documentation. So I can use the blue plus button. I can use the search bar at the top just to find the documents more easily, and I'll pop in PF1, select that entity in its environment document. Now, you can select multiple, maybe some things come out of your planning documentation, your communication with management, which leads you to then update the permanent file and you want to reference both places. That's perfectly possible. You can select as many as you want. So we'll see the document referenced here. Now, we can take it one stage further and we can use this grey plus button to actually say what procedure within this document, where in this document did we identify the risk. And so I can select my industry procedure, my industry section here, just so that's fully referenced through. Now, we're now asked about the audit response. How are we going to respond to this risk in the audit? Now, we haven't been into the work program at all. We haven't added any procedures into the work program. But at this point, it's really nice while the risk's fresh in your head to actually use this blue plus button to link the risk through to an audit response. So I'll hit the blue plus button. You'll see all the audit file documentation. You can either search using the document reference, or if you're not sure what the reference is, just pop work program, or at least start writing work program into the search. And then I can select my stocks work program. So I'm going to respond to this risk in my stocks work program. To take it one stage further, what procedure are we going to perform to respond to this risk? I can use the grey plus button again. Now, when you first open this, let me scroll down a little bit. When you first open this, you will only see the procedures that are actually visible in the work program at the moment. And yeah, I can't see any in there that I could use to respond to the risk. But if I select to show hidden, that's going to show me all of the procedures in this list that are in the background of the work program that we haven't added in yet. The easiest way to get down to my tested detail, because that's what I want to use to respond to the risk, is to use this minus button to suppress each of the sections until we come down to our tested detail. And I can then review the procedures that are included, again, suppressing certain sections if I want to, until we come down to the procedures that we want to use. Now, it may be that you're looking at the procedures and you can't see the full description, or that's probably quite likely. Some of the procedures can be quite lengthy. As you'll see from my screen, and I appreciate you're probably not going to be able to read that writing on a screen share, it does pop up when you hover over a procedure and tell you the full detail of that procedure. So what we can do here, we can select the procedure that we want to use to respond to the risk. Now, it pops up and says, hang on a minute, you want to link to a procedure you haven't added into the work program yet. And what this message box tells us is that if we do link to it, that procedure won't be hidden anymore. That means it's included in our work program. So that when we actually come to prepare our work program, consider the procedures to include, I don't actually need to think about this risk anymore because I've already added the procedure in. So it just cuts down some of the work I need to do a little bit later. So while we're adding the risk, we've said the relevant areas, the relevant assertions. where we've identified it in our documentation, and how we're going to be responding to the risk within our audit. So I'll hit save. Okay, we will also add a financial statement level risk just so you can see the differences on the screen there. So I'll use the plus button again, add another risk, and this will be the associated going concern risk. So I'll add my title, we'll add a description again, and then this time we'll select this as a financial statement level risk. We get to select the risk status as before, but what's missing this time, we don't link the financial statement risk through to a certain area because, of course, financial statement level risks can impact the financial statements as a whole. We link it through to the source reference of risk again. And this time I'm just going to pop it to PF 110, the going concern document. And again, we can link it through to the specific procedure. And then we can say how we're going to be responding to the risk. And without going through the full detail here, I'll just link to my going concern work program. I'm not actually going to tie this one through to specific procedures, but in reality, I would recommend that you do use the plus button to link it to the specific procedures. And I will then save that one as well. And again, we see the confirmation in the bottom right that we've created the risk. Now, linking the risk through to the source of the risk gives you this risk indicator to the side of whatever procedure it is where you identified the risk. So that's really nice from a review perspective, because as a reviewer, I'll be reading this, reading the details here, and I'll think, yeah, we've got a risk there, potential audit risk. And I can see it's already been raised, and clicking on it, it will show me the narrative there. Now, it does show twice at the moment. If I refresh the screen, it'll only be there once. It just shows twice when you've just added a risk and you're still within the document. But if we refresh the screen, that would just be there once. Okay, so that's how we add our own risks. Best to do when we come across them in our documentation. But as I said earlier, we can also add risks into our audit engagement from the risk library. To access the risk library, you've got two different options. Risk and control screen at the top, and you'll see a risk library button here, or we've got the plus button up at the top right of the screen. And using the plus button, we can select to add a risk from the library. Now this opens the risk library in a new tab, so you're not going to lose your position where you were working back within the other tab. So the risk library contains all of the risks that Mercia reviews in their procedures manual and in the examples that they include in there. So it is quite a comprehensive library of different risks. It's broken into two sections. You've got a financial statement section, financial statement level risks, and you've got an assertion section, risks targeting specific audit areas and specific assertions within those areas. On the left-hand side, we've got some filters. We want to look for particular assertions, particular risk statuses, and we've got a filter at the top of the screen as well to filter by audit area. So in this example, I could look specifically at my income and debtors. And you'll see various potential risks being recorded here. To add any risks from the library to our engagement, we can select the risks that we want to add, pick out a couple here, and then up at the top right of the screen, you'll see tick icons appeared with the little number 2 next to it. If I click on that, it will show me the risks that I'm going to be adding into the file, and I can just select to add to engagement. That extra tab closes automatically, and still on the risk page here, where I'd gone to, you can see we've now got those 2 additional risks added to the screen here. So this risk screen is quite useful. Firstly, it will show you all the risks recorded in the engagement file, both at financial statement and assertion level. But we can click into any of these risks. So I can click into my going concern risk, review more details. I can make changes to the risks. I could update the risk status. We can link the risk through to controls, and we can conclude on the risk as well. Has the risk been addressed? Do we need an audit response? Is there a significant control deficiency? So there are some extra fields we can complete here compared to when we were documenting the risk. Now, for the risks you add from the library, you will need to come to this risks page and you will need to expand them because you can be possibly a little more specific in the description, but you'll certainly want to reference them through to the source of the risk, reference them through to an audit response, link to any controls, and conclude on the risk as well. Okay.
So can I just ask you a quick question? Sorry.
Yes.
We've just had a question come in about the risk library, which is how do you get to the risk library? I haven't seen this on my engagements.
Oh, okay. Should be from the risk screen itself. There should be a button at the top just for risk library, and selecting that should launch the risk library. Alternatively, at the top right, plus button and add a risk from the library, and that launches the risk library as well.
Presumably if this is, yeah, okay, so confirmed I don't have the button anywhere. So if the viewers aren't seeing the button on their engagements, presumably that's to do with the template version and or any or the way that it's been set up by the firm administrator. Is that right?
Yes, it would be more due to the template version rather than how it's been set up by the administrator. If you're not working on the most recent template, company audit, you may not see the risk library in there. Also, depending on what template you're looking at, the functionality gets released into the templates at slightly different times. Templates are all updated on a cycle. So some functionality will be added into company audit template that won't yet be available in, say, the charity or academies template, and that will be added in when they're next updated. But certainly checking your template version number would be the recommended place to start to make sure you're on the most recent one.
Also, some suggestion offered by one of our other attendees is that this is for new engagements, not for old engagements. So is that something that would only appear if you're creating an engagement since that functionality was introduced?
Yes, it would do. Yeah.
Okay. We've also got a suggestion from one of our colleagues that the risk library is not available on charity engagements at this time. So if it's charity engagements you're looking at, then it wouldn't be there.
No.
Thanks, James.
Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good questions, and yeah, keep them coming. Okay. So at this point, we'll move into the Mercia documentation. So back in my B01, actually, I'll get back to it, close the tab. Always watch out where you are following annotations through because they do open in new tabs and you can very easily end up with quite a lot across the top of the screen. But back to this point about evaluating the risks and their impact on the financial statements, I'm going to jump back to the B30 document that we already introduced very briefly. So the B30 is broken up into different sections. First section will be considering risks of material misstatement at the financial statement level. And now within the identify risk field, we'll see that we've got the financial statement level risk there that we added, our going concern risk. You can see that the description will automatically populate based on the description we added when we were creating the risk. And we'll see that it's also not a fraud risk in this case. We're asked, does it affect risk of material misstatement at the assertion level? It will be yes or no there. And then we need to assess the potential impact on the financial statements. And again, these are just text fields that you'll pop text into. We'll consider the effect on the planned audit approach. Now, these fields do expand down the page, and depending on how much detail you are populating in these fields, it can make this particular row of the table quite lengthy. So one possible alternative there would be to refer to C notes instead within the fields. And what you're then able to do is use the annotation icon to add an annotation next to this row. I can select that this is a note annotation type, and then you can put in as much text as you want within here, and it's not going to change the face of this document in the background. You can add subtitles or titles, make things bold, underline, full formatting and everything, and just put in quite a lot of text. I'm just trying to make sure I put in enough just to demonstrate how this then appears. So the way this appears on this row, we get the annotation icon. Hovering over it, we can see the text that we added. I can't see everything, but if I then click on it, it opens in its own little panel in a window that I can scroll up and down, which may make it slightly easier to review than on the face of the document itself. We'll then use this square plus button to add another row, select our next financial statement level risk, and continue on through. We'll consider the fraud risk at the financial statement level, and as it says, you'll be referring to B34 there. That'll be your fraud risk assessment document as well. And after our commentary, there will come down to risk of material misstatement at the assertion level. Now, the clues about how to use this section are all included in the text above, because the text above tells us, in short, that for each assertion level risk, further detail on each is on B31 or B32 for key accounting estimates. We should be adding remove rows as required, completing one B32 for each risk relating to an accounting estimate and one B31 for each risk identified in the table. Now, that's not the only clue about how to actually complete these fields, because above each column, you get these numbers in square brackets. Now, these numbers in square brackets refer to notes, and the notes are all down at the bottom of the document, down here. We'll come back and revisit the notes in a moment. So here we need to select a risk again. And this will be the assertion level risks that we've added to the file. So I'll add my stock maybe overvalued risk. And you can see it populates the relevant assertion. And I also get the same row in the detailed table down below. Next, we need to consider the inherent risk. And this is where we do want to make sure we take a look at that note 3, because that will tell us what we should be doing here. Note 3 will tell you that we should be assessing the likelihood and magnitude of misstatement to assess the inherent risk. And at the bottom of that note, it tells us this assessment is performed on the B31. So until I've been to the B31 document, I can't actually complete the inherent risk on the B30. Now, as it says above, we have a separate B31 document for each risk that we identify on this form. So my recommendation would be add in your extra rows for your other risks and select the risks here. Let me just pick them out. Because by selecting them here, you are creating the B31 forms for each risk. So now I can just go to the B31 using the document reference on the right, and I already have a separate form which I can move between using the drop down at the top for each risk that I've identified on the B30. If you don't add them all on the B30 first, when you come to the B31, you'll just have one document, and you'll then go back to the B30 to select the next, go back to the B31, and you end up going backwards and forwards a bit. So add them all to the B30 first, and then you can just work through the documentation. Okay, so on the B31, we'll see some of the information at the top that we added when we were creating the risk. And we then need to assess the inherent risk. What are the inherent risk factors here? And you'll select them using the checkboxes, add any commentary, justification within the additional information field. We're then asked to assess the likelihood of misstatement. And you'd need to do this for each relevant assertion. So in my example here, I've only got one assertion selected, but if you did have multiple selected, you would see separate lines here and two selection boxes on the right to select the likelihood of misstatement. And again, we'll justify in the additional information field. We assess the magnitude of misstatement for each relevant assertion again, using the drop-down box. And then we look at our inherent risk of material misstatement. Now, you'll see Caseware has automatically populated this with a value for us. That's based on our assessment of the likelihood and magnitude of misstatement. But if for some reason we disagree with the value that has been populated, you can click in and say, yes, I want to override the field. And that does then allow you to set your own inherent risk level. Now, from a reviewer's perspective, you can see that that field has turned sort of pinkish color, got a bit of a pink highlight to it. So that tells you that the field's been overridden. So if you are a reviewer reviewing this document and you see it, just double check the reasoning behind it, check the justification in the additional information field as to why it's been set at what it's been set at. But I will remove that override. We then come to our control risk. Read the note. It's only required where we plan to test the operating effectiveness of control. If you are testing the operating effectiveness of control, you can assess the level of control risk here. If not, you'll leave it set at non-applicable. And then we have our overall risk of material misstatement at the assertion level for each relevant assertion for this risk. And you'll see, because I've got control risk at non-applicable, the overall risk of material misstatement is the same as the inherent risk. And once we've done that for one risk, you'll move to the top of the document and go to the next page and do the same again. Now, I'm not going to make you watch me do the same again. So instead, we'll pop back to the B30 and carry on working through that document. Easiest way to get back to it, use the document map on the right-hand side because it should be in your recent items list. For some reason, mine's decided not to show. So I shall search for it instead to jump back there quickly. And now typically it appears. Okay. Okay, so the results from the B31 will populate our detail of assertion level risks, where alongside each row we can consider the effect on planning in this final field. In our summary of assertion level risks, I'd refer to the table below. I mean, in this case, I've only got one assertion, so it's quite easy. If I've assessed it here, inherent risk is a 4, it's going to be a 4 here as well. Control risk, non-applicable, and risk of material misstatement, a 4. And again, I can consider my effect on planning, which again, likely to be very similar between the two there. Okay, so once we've considered that, we'll then look at our accounting estimates risk. Now, this is directing us to the B32 form straight away. So we can't do anything on the B30 itself in relation to accounting estimates. We have to go to the B32 to do it. So we'll jump there now. Now this B32 document, it looks a little bit like the B31 in that you've got the big grey border all the way around the outside. And a lot of the time when you see this big grey border, it means you're going to have a separate page for each particular risk, each accounting estimate. We're going to have a separate document within the B32 here to complete. Now for the B32, we can create new pages using the new button at the top. And you'll see I've now got 2 available in the drop down. I can move between them using that. When we populate the title of a key accounting estimate, so if I pop in work in progress here, you'll see the name at the top of the document gets updated within the drop down, making it easier to find the actual form you want to work on. So there is a bit of documentation to do on the B32. First, we'll set out key assertions that are relevant, and you'll select whatever you consider relevant there. Again, whichever assertions you select, you will need to perform a risk assessment for. And then we have our documentation. How is the accounting estimate determined? What are our preliminary considerations? Risk assessment procedures? How uncertain? How much subjectivity is there? And then we come to assessing the inherent risk and material misstatement. Now, again, we haven't got the likelihood of misstatement and magnitude of misstatement broken down here. But just remember, wherever you see this light bulb symbol, that means there is additional guidance available. And if you click on it, it does still make reference to us assessing the likelihood and magnitude of misstatement. So I'll probably perform that assessment, justify it within my additional information section. Some of it may come out of the documentation you've done above. And we can then assess for each assertion the inherent risk. And you can pop in your assessment. We'll look at control risk again, which only required where we plan to test the operating effectiveness of controls. And then we come down to our final risk and material misstatement at the assertion level. Now, the key question here that will drive this accounting estimate back onto the B30 is this final question. Does this accounting estimate pose significant risk of material misstatement, or is it an area of focus? If we answer yes, it will populate the B30. No, obviously it won't. So I'll pop back to the B30 again, and we'll see where that pulls through. Down within that accounting estimates risk section, that's now shown. And we can now consider the effect of this on our planning, the effect of our assessment. We have our commentary on the fraud risk at the assertion level. We've got our stand-back assessments to perform, and then the overall conclusion, which the overall conclusion is something we can click on to confirm. Turns it blue. Okay. So now we've completed all those documents. Obviously, I should be signing them off at the top, but I'll just flag that that's completed. We've got our meeting of the RI. We'll hold an imaginary meeting and pretend we've updated that documentation. And we're then told that for each individual area, we should be assessing the risk and material misstatement so that we can record the planned audit approach on the B40 document. Now, the actual risk assessment that we perform here, we haven't got a link here directly to the page that we perform it on, but that we access it by going to risk and controls at the top of the page and then onto the assessment tab. So we've got 3 different tabs here. It's on this document, you can see all the different audit areas in the center of the screen. And probably the first thing I would do when I come to this document is actually review what areas are included. We've got indicators telling us, highlighting to us where we've got material areas. And I can see here I've got intangible fixed assets with no balance at all. And investments, it's only got £50 there. So I'm probably not going to do a risk assessment on those. Now you can click into any area and you do get access to an exclude option. And clicking exclude on the right there, I'll just do it again for investments, will take that area out of the risk assessment screen. So we're not going to assess it at all. Now you will also notice that you will have a section P, intragroup balances, transactions and consolidations in every audit engagement. So if this entity isn't part of a group, I'll exclude that one as well. Now it has let us take things out very easily, which as auditors, we're used to justifying every single thing we're doing, justify everything on the file and document everything. So it would be a good idea to hit the show excluded button at the top of the screen, toggle on the show excluded. You can see which ones are excluded because they have this sort of icon next to them. But we can then click into them, and now we can see a field where we can say why we've excluded this area. So it might just be as simple as it's not material. You might go into slightly more detail than that. But for the purpose of today, that's enough for me. And once you have gone in and populated that detail, turn off show excluded again so you don't accidentally still go and perform a risk assessment on them. Now, you will need to click into each area on here to perform your assessment. We're just going to focus on the stock section. We get a reminder of the financial statement level risks on the left to factor into our assessment. And within the stock section itself, you can see I've got a risk indicator alongside it. That tells me I've got an assertion level risk for this area. I'll click on the area to expand it, and we can see some information that we can maybe factor into our risk assessment here. Current year figures, variances, the assertion level risk, probably quite important there. We also have access to an analysis button at the top. Now, pressing the analysis button will open the analysis tab of the work program. And it's on here, you're going to see the balances that you've got allocated to that audit area. So I've just got one here, stock, not too exciting. You will see some tables which will set out movements over time. And then you'll see some ratios. Now the ratios will change depending on what audit area you are looking at. But for stock, we see our gross margin, our stock turnover, various ratios there that we can review and factor into our assessment. So I'll close out of that tab and we'll move on to come down to the assessment. Now, straight away, you'll notice every single assertion is selected. Now, not every assertion will be relevant for every area within every audit. And the assertions that we select here will feed through to our work programs later, helping us to make sure our procedures are targeting the assertions we've said are relevant. So it's really important that here you deselect anything that you don't consider to be relevant for this audit area in this particular audit. So you'll just go in and deselect whatever's not relevant. We then get to assess the likelihood of misstatement. Score it 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high. I'm just going to pick things out at random here just to get a bit of variety. I'll say variety and put most of them the same. But what you might want to consider when you are assessing this is that for valuation here, I've got the risk indicator. So I've got my assertion level risk raised against valuation. Now I've already assessed the likelihood of misstatement for that assertion level risk. And if it's impacting valuation, I should probably factor in that risk assessment into whatever scoring I'm setting for the area as a whole. It may not be exactly the same, but I should at least be considering it. So that's where you might want to reference back to the B31 for that particular risk. We'll do the same for our magnitude of misstatement, MOM, at the top, and we'll perform our assessment. Again, I'll just select some at random. And then you'll see the inherent risk is automatically calculated. If we disagree with the automatic calculation, we can override it. But on this particular screen, it doesn't change color. You don't get notified it's overridden. So as a reviewer, if you are a reviewer, just pay attention to the scorings, make sure they make sense. And then we move down to the second table, the risk of material misstatement table. We see our inherent risk. We have our control risk, which I'll set at non-applicable because I'm not placing any reliance on controls. I'm not testing operating effectiveness. And then that will calculate our risk of material misstatement for each assertion for the audit area for us. And we can use the field down at the bottom to set out our reasoning and our justification. Now you will note that we do have sign-offs for every single risk assessment, every audit area. So you will come up to the top and sign it off before moving on to the next section. And once you've completed them all, you do have a sign-off at the top of the document as well. Okay, so that's our risk assessment for each financial statement area. Shortly, we'll look at how that's going to help us develop our work programs. But before we move on to that, I want to move away from the risk assessment side of things and just touch on controls a little bit. So we saw in our B01 how we're asked to complete the B24 design implementation of controls form. So I'm going to jump there now. We'll open that form up. So within this form, we should be, looking at the design and evaluating the implementation of controls addressing risk of material misstatement at the assertion level, and IT environment controls. Now, when you go to add a row here to identify a control, you get access to a drop-down menu again. Now, there's nothing in it because I haven't documented a control. So the only way to get this to populate is to add a control using the plus button. By selecting the plus button at the top right and saying control. You can also access the new control button from the controls page that we'll look at shortly within the risk and controls screen. Now, before I add a control, I wouldn't go through documenting absolutely everything because there's quite a lot of fields to complete when you're adding a control. I would focus on what controls do I actually need to assess on this document. And to do that, I'll be referring to the reason for identification here. We've got the note reference, note 1. So note 1 tells us what controls we should be identifying. So controls addressing a significant risk. Controls over journal entries, controls where we're testing operating effectiveness, other controls appropriate for obtaining audit evidence from our audit opinion, controls at the user entity relating to services provided by a service organisation. So they're the controls I want to focus on. So I'm going to imagine I've identified a control relating to the significant risk that I recorded earlier. So I do want to assess the design and implementation of it. So I'm going to hit the plus button and then come down and select to add new control. We need to give the control a title. I'm going to say stock valuation. Okay, excuse my spelling. Reviewed. So they carry out a review of the stock valuation on a monthly basis. We'll give it a description again. It's up to you how much detail you go into here. You may well have a lot more detail in your systems notes anyway. So you may not want to go to the nth degree here. What audit areas is this control addressing? It's going to be my stock section. Again, I could expand down through the mapping, through the groupings there, but I'll just select my stock section. And what assertions is it addressing again? Then asked, what type of control is it? Entity, IT, financial statement. If we select this an entity or financial statement level control, that will populate the top part of my B24 document. If it's an IT control, that will fall into the IT environment section. Risks. We can link this control through to any risks it's addressing. So I'll select the risk I added earlier. Then we set out some attributes about the control. Now, some of these fields will populate the Mercia documentation, so we do want to be completing them. How often is the control carried out? Say it's monthly. How is it executed? Automatic, IT dependent, or manual? If it is IT dependent, or if it is an IT control, you may want to complete the IT dependent report and IT system affected fields. But I'm going to leave them in this case. Is it a preventative or detective control? Is it a key control? Maturity field here, this is an interesting one. For the maturity field, if you are used to assessing maturity on a scale of 1 to 5, you can complete this field. If the scale of 1 to 5 is quite meaningless to you in terms of assessing maturity, I'd leave it blank. We then have the effect. Is it direct or indirect? Then we have a question about the design and implementation of the control. Who is the control operator? Now, to select a control operator here, the control operator must be added to the entity as a contact back in Caseware Cloud, in the cloud platform. So you may not want to add all your contacts into the cloud platform, in which case I'd leave the control operator blank, probably just making sure I'd referenced it in the description or somewhere elsewhere in my documentation. And I can then save that control. So now we've created the control, you can use the drop-down menu to select the control. Stock valuation reviewed monthly. I can set out the reason for identification, again, referring to the notes at the bottom for a description of what A, B, C, D, and E mean. But I know A is a control addressing a risk determined to be a significant risk, so I'll select it here. We then need to consider the design and implementation of the control. Now, we can't actually do that on the B24 itself. That's carried out on the B24A document. We have got a document reference to the right, but on the B24, we can click these little arrows that are next to each field, and that opens the B24A for this control in a sort of pop-up window. So we can see some of the details we completed when we added the control. And we can then say, has it been designed effectively? Has the control been implemented? Is there a test of operating effectiveness? And then we get space to record any control deficiencies. Of course, we'll be justifying our responses as we go, setting out more in these text fields here. Control deficiencies here. If you do identify any deficiencies, you can use the plus button to set out what deficiency you've identified, the impact on the risk and material misstatement at the assertion level, and the effect on the audit procedures. So that's in relation to the control that we've identified here. Now, the only thing you don't get when you're using this pop-up window is at the top of the actual B24A document, you do have an issues flag and a sign-off indicator, so you can sign the document off. Now, from this window, we can't sign off the B24A or raise an issue. So if you did want to do either of those things, that's where you might use the document link on the right or open the B24A separately. And once we've done that for one control, we'll use the plus or the minus, well, the plus button on the right to add a row for the next control. Don't use the minus button because that gets rid of the row, the work you've just done. And we'll then do the same for the IT environment. Any IT controls that we identify work in the same way there. And once we've done that, we should, of course, be considering updating our risk assessments based on these results as well. We have our conclusions, yes or no, and then we have our list of deficiencies that we've identified across all controls. So they're all pulled back onto the B24 document. So when you are preparing your management letter at the end of the audit, your communication with management, you should really be coming back to the B24 just to make sure any deficiencies you identified at the planning stage, if they need to be reported to management, that you've included them on that management letter. And in fact, on the question beneath, if we say, yes, they are significant deficiencies, you are told they must be communicated to those charged with governance. Now, the only other thing I want to mention about controls is on the risk and control screen, you have got your risk screen we've looked at, our assessment screen. You've also got a control screen. Now, when you do look at controls here, you'll see the summarized view. Click in to expand them. This is where you can make changes to any information that you completed already. You will come down and you will see there are a lot more fields available. Fields for documenting our evaluation of the operating effectiveness, for our review of the design and implementation. These fields don't populate the Mercia documentation. So if you do want to use them to help in your documentation, they are there for you to use, but I'm not going to go through them all today. And we can then sign off the controls again. Okay, so how does all this actually help us populate our work programs? Now, on this section, I'm not actually going to spend too much time on it because Tom and one of my other colleagues, Tony, they did a webinar on this a couple of weeks ago on actually tailoring your work programs, and that did touch on this a little bit. But just because it finishes everything off nicely, we're going to move through to our B40 document where we consider what work programs we want within our audit engagement and where we detail our planned audit approach. So this does take a moment to populate because it's loading up details of the risk assessment and the relevant assertions for each section. Now, when this does populate, you will see on my screen, it is going off to the right-hand side of the screen and it is being slower than normal. There we go. but that's because I've got my screen zoomed in for the webinar. Ordinarily, it will fit it all on one screen. Now, I'm going to use the document map on the left just to jump down to the stock section, where it didn't take me quite there, but close enough, where you can see we have got an audit program required, but we can see the relevant assertions, or the assertions we've said are relevant from our risk assessment, and we can see our risk assessment scores so that we can factor that into our planned audit approach that we'll detail here. And then we can indicate what work program sections we require. To follow this through to the work program, use the annotation just to open up the work program. And the few things I want to highlight here, firstly, you will see a table appear at the top. This table again pulls through the assertions we have said are relevant and our risk assessment scores, and it's going to help us build relevant procedures into our work program. But before I look at that, I just want to scroll down past the general and mandatory tests, just to show you our tests of detail here. So this is the procedure that we added when we were creating our risk in the file. And we were linking that risk to an audit response. It's already in our work program, so I don't need to think about that risk again, really, at this stage. And we get the risk indicator there on the right. But using this response table at the top, we can say what types of procedures we want to carry out for each assertion, and you'll see these warning signs. Now, the idea behind this is you'll say what types of procedures you want to carry out. You'll then go and add procedures into your audit program. And then you'd come back up to the top and check if you've got any warning signs remaining. If you have got warning signs remaining, and they are these red ones, it will mean that you haven't added any procedures into your work program of that type addressing that particular assertion. So it means our risk assessment is really going to help us drive the work we're going to do within the audit. Okay. And that covers off everything I wanted to run through with you today. So I'll just pass back over to Tom to see if we've had any more questions come in.
Thanks, James. So we have got a couple of questions that I think we've got time to cover, and we're going to summarise all of the questions in our Q&A document when we publish that on our knowledge base. So going back to, well, while we're talking about controls, what is the difference between entity and financial statement within the controls?
Well, an entity, financial statement level control would be directly over the financial statements themselves, whereas an entity level control would be a control in place within the entity that's put in place to have controls over a certain thing, but without specifically the consideration of something within the financial statements.
Yeah. Thanks, James. The other one we have is for Risk Library, which is a popular topic today. So we were talking earlier about the Risk Library being available in new engagements. Will it be available for files that are rolled forward? So if you have a file where perhaps it wasn't available and then you roll it forward, will that then appear?
If your template has been updated since the last file was created, then when you roll forwards the file, the rolling forwards process actually looks at your template that you've got published at that point in time and the content you had in your last engagement file. So the template will automatically be updated to the most recent template. So I would expect the risk library to be in there. And that template is then populated with whatever you had put in the file you were rolling forwards.
Okay, thanks very much. As I say, we're going to summarise these responses in our Q&A document, which will be signposted to you when it's available in the next day or so. I think we're going to just go through the wrap up now. We're almost out of time, so I'm just going to share my screen and jump back to the slides and replace James's screen share. And we want to go to this here. Hopefully you can see my slides again. So you can use the Q&A button there if you haven't done so already. Continue to submit your questions. We won't be able to answer them on the live at this point, but we'll get back to you afterwards. So just a bit of the usual signposting. So we have our YouTube channel. That's Client Services Caseware UK, and that's where the recording is going to go in the next day or so. We have a webinar playlist. We also have lots of quick vids on there. So a lot of the things that we talk to you about in webinars go into much shorter videos if you want something that's more bite-sized. So you can head over to there and subscribe and set your notifications and all the usual YouTube stuff so that you'll be notified when new recordings are added. And we've also got our LinkedIn page, which again is Client Services Caseware UK, and you can follow us there for signposting of webinars, but also any news within the business. And you can go to our events page at the address on screen to view all of our upcoming events, not just webinars, but other events as well. And you can see agendas and register to attend. And finally, our knowledge base, which is my.caseware.com. If you have any links to our previous help site, they will redirect here. So don't worry if you have any old links. My.caseware.com, that's where you'll be able to find our articles and additional guidance, including the recording of this webinar and the accompanying Q&A document. And that'll be in the next day or so. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, found it useful. Take care, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much.